Claire heard the words before she saw the face. "Do not marry him," her grandmother's voice, trembling, tears cutting silver lines down cheeks. Claire hadn't seen in 3 years. "Go to his mother's house tomorrow morning. You will see the truth." She woke, gasping, the dream still wrapped around her like a wet coat. 3 weeks. 3 weeks until she stood at the altar in the dress hanging in her closet. The invitations already mailed, the venue already paid for. Everything about her life looked finished, polished, complete. And still, underneath all of it, a fear she couldn't name had been living in her chest for months. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 30 years old, and I believed I had found the one thing my grandmother always told me to wait for. A love that brought peace instead of confusion. She raised me after I lost my parents, and every lesson she ever gave me came back to that same idea. Trust the quiet feeling. Trust the version of yourself that gets nervous before you understand why. I met Robert Collins at the bank where I worked as an accountant. He was polished in the way that made rooms rearrange themselves around him, confident, warm, generous with his attention. He talked about a future so vivid I could almost furnish it. A house, children's names we half joked about, a life so complete it felt like relief just to imagine it. When he proposed over candlelight, I said yes before I even let myself think. But there were things I chose not to look at too closely. His mother, Teresa, had never once looked at me like a woman about to join her family. On my first visit to her home, her questions came dressed as small talk. My salary, my savings, the apartment I owned outright. She smiled the entire time. It didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like an appraisal. I told myself it was nothing. Grief teaches you to survive uncertainty by explaining it away. Then came the dream. My grandmother's voice was clearer than any memory I had of her waking. "Claire, listen to me. Robert is not who he says he is. Go to his mother's house alone. You need to know the truth." I woke up shaking, my heart slamming against my ribs like it already knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I didn't tell Robert where I was going that morning. I told myself I was being foolish, chasing a nightmare, instead of trusting the man I was about to marry. But my hands were already reaching for my car keys before I finished the thought. When I pulled up to Teresa's house, a woman was leaving through the back door. Blonde, maybe my age, moving with the kind of urgency that comes from not wanting to be seen. She didn't look at me. She just walked fast, got into her car, and left like the house itself was something to escape. Teresa answered the door a few minutes later, composed as always, as if nothing had just happened in her own driveway. She let me in, and there, sitting open on the kitchen table, was a folder she hadn't expected me to see. While she stepped into the kitchen, I looked. Names, a list of women, addresses, property values, notes on savings accounts, on inheritances, on who owned their homes outright and who didn't. It wasn't wedding planning, it wasn't anything close. It read like a ledger, like inventory. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, who the woman leaving the house had been. Something in Teresa's face shifted. She didn't answer with words. She walked to a shelf, pulled down an old photo album, and set it in front of me without a single explanation needed. Robert, younger, standing beside that same blonde woman in a wedding dress. Not dating, not an old flame from before we met. Married. I don't know how to describe the feeling of the floor disappearing beneath you while you're still standing on it. That's the closest I can get. That night I confronted him. I asked him directly why he had never told me he'd been married. The charm dropped off his face like a mask sliding loose. He called it a mistake. Ancient history. Something he'd buried so deep it didn't feel real to him anymore. He said, as if that made it acceptable that I hadn't known. Then I mentioned the folder. I watched the last piece of performance leave his eyes. What replaced it wasn't guilt. It was anger. Cold, immediate, and unmistakably real for the first time since I'd known him. That was the moment I understood. Everything gentle about Robert Collins had been constructed. This was what was underneath. I called my best friend Margaret that same night. Together we tracked down the blonde woman from Teresa's driveway. Her name was Lisa Moreno, and what she told us confirmed every fear I hadn't let myself fully feel yet. Robert had convinced her to sell her house, promising they'd invest the money together into something bigger, something for their future. She trusted him. She signed the papers. And then he was gone, along with everything she'd built her security on. Lisa wasn't the only one. Once we started looking, more women surfaced, each with a version of the same story, each carrying the same particular shame that comes from realizing you were chosen not for who you are, but for what you had. Robert had a pattern, refined over what looked like years. He sought out women who were independent, who owned property, who had spent their lives building something stable, and then he made himself indispensable to that stability, right up until the moment he dismantled it. I hired a private investigator, a man named Alan Harris, because by then, I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof strong enough to stand in a courtroom. What Alan uncovered went further than I'd braced myself for. Robert Collins wasn't even his real name. He'd built an entire architecture of false identities, different names in different cities, fabricated business records, forged documents stacked on forged documents. The man I had planned to marry did not exist. He never had. And Teresa had known. She'd helped him build it, house by house, woman by woman. But when the evidence started closing in, when it became clear the truth was surfacing whether she participated or not, something in her calculation changed. She agreed to testify against her own son. I don't know if it was guilt or self-preservation. Maybe both. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that her testimony, combined with Lisa's, combined with the paper trail Alan had assembled, became the foundation of a case too solid to talk his way out of. More victims came forward once the story broke. Women who had spent months, sometimes years, believing they'd simply been unlucky in love, when in fact, they'd been targeted with precision. Robert was arrested. I sat in that courtroom and watched the man who had once promised me forever standing small, under fluorescent light, stripped of every layer he'd built to make himself seem larger than life. He was convicted of fraud and criminal conspiracy. But the sentencing wasn't the part that stayed with me. What stayed with me was standing outside that courthouse afterward, surrounded by women who had never met each other before this. All of us having survived some version of the same carefully engineered lie. Watching them reclaim pieces of their lives felt like more of a victory than any verdict could have delivered. Months later, my grandmother came to me again in a dream. This time there were no tears in her eyes. She stood in a field full of flowers, sunlight everywhere, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since I was a child. "You are free now," she told me. I woke up crying, but for the first time in a long while, those tears didn't come from fear. They came from something closer to relief, the kind that only arrives once you're finally on the other side of the thing that almost destroyed you. I think about that warning constantly, how close I came to walking down an aisle toward a man who had already picked out, in some quiet, calculating corner of his mind, what he planned to take from me, how thin the line was between the life I thought I wanted and the one I actually escaped. People ask me sometimes if I believe the dream was really her. I don't know how to answer that with certainty. What I know is this: the fear I felt in the weeks before that wedding wasn't nothing. It wasn't cold feet, and it wasn't nerves. It was information, arriving in the only language my body knew how to speak, clearly enough for me to finally listen. My grandmother spent her whole life teaching me that love is supposed to feel like peace, not confusion. Not a slow, creeping unease you learn to explain away because everything on paper looks perfect. I had ignored that lesson for months, buried under invitations and dress fittings and a timeline that made it easier to keep moving forward than to stop and ask hard questions. The dream didn't hand me the truth. It handed me the courage to go looking for it myself. If there's one thing I would want anyone listening to this to take with them, it's this. Trust the discomfort that doesn't have a clear explanation. Trust the version of yourself that hesitates even when everyone around you says everything looks fine. Sometimes that hesitation isn't fear of commitment. Sometimes it's the only part of you paying close enough attention to see what's actually there. I never got to thank my grandmother while she was alive for teaching me to listen to that voice. But I like to think that final dream, the one in the field of flowers, was her way of letting me know she'd heard me say it anyway. I rebuilt my life slowly after that. I sold the apartment Teresa had once asked so many pointed questions about, not because I needed to, but because I wanted a fresh start, untouched by any of it. I kept the friendships that had shown up for me without hesitation, especially Margaret, who never once made me feel foolish for how long it took me to see what was in front of me. And I kept the memory of my grandmother's voice, not as something eerie or unexplainable, but as the clearest expression of the thing she'd spent her whole life trying to teach me. Some people go their whole lives without ever getting a warning loud enough to hear. I got mine in a dream, 3 weeks before I would have made the worst mistake of my life. I choose to be grateful for that, even now, even with everything it cost me to learn the truth. Because in the end, the wedding I lost was never the life I was meant to have. The life I was meant to have started the morning I chose to listen. The morning I drove to a house I wasn't invited to, looked inside a folder I wasn't supposed to see, and finally let myself believe what my own instincts had been trying to tell me for months. That morning didn't just save me from Robert Collins. It gave me back the version of myself I had slowly stopped trusting. And that, more than any courtroom verdict, more than any consequence he faced, is the truest ending to this story. Not revenge, not justice, though I'm grateful for both. Just the quiet, hard-won return of my own voice, loud enough now that I don't think I'll ever have to be talked out of listening to it again.